Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Walters Art Museum Live Artist Talk. Tonight, my name is Ellen Hoobler. I am the William B. Ziff Jr. Associate Curator for Art of the Americas here at the Walters. And tonight, I'm very delighted to be in conversation with Muriel Hasbun. Muriel is an artist and educator whose work focuses on issues of cultural identity, migration, and memory. Her awards and distinctions are too many to even include all of them here, but include being a finalist for Baltimore's own Sondheim Prize, a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, a Maryland State Arts Council Individual Artist Award in Photography and in Media, a U.S. Department of State American Association of Museums Connect grant. She has also been a Fulbright Scholar and has represented the country of El Salvador in the Venice Biennale. As an artist, her work is in the permanent collections of many museums, including the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Art Museum of the Americas, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Building on her career as both a socially engaged artist and a photography professor, she is currently the founder and director of Laberinto Projects, a transnational cultural memory initiative fostering contemporary art practices, social inclusion, and dialogue in El Salvador and its U.S. diaspora. Let's go ahead and bring up the first of the works that we'll be looking at tonight. And let's just go ahead and get started. Muriel, welcome. Such a delight to be able to speak with you. And let's just jump right in. Tell me a little bit about this work. How are memory and identity incorporated into your work?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be in conversation with you. And I'm just really pleased to have you and everybody else who is listening here tonight. So thank you for being here. So I want to give you a little bit of background about, my journey as a photographer. I've been interested in developing a language for what is not really readily visible. I've always been interested in what's under the surface of things in some ways. I've been influenced by poetry, by Marcel Proust, and the idea of synesthetic memory or metaphor. In my work, I've created a dialogue between the past and the present, and between what is really readily seen and what is imagined. And through a layering effect, which can be made either through actual layers of different photographs or because of how the photograph is made, when I see it, I create a fluid space for us to respond in a multisensorial way. I like that, when you look at a photograph, you think about more than just the visual, and that you react with your body, and you have, a way of entering memory that way. And also think about the experience of the present and the past as we look at all of these different layers or within a photograph. So from this particular photograph is from a series called Santos y Sombras, or Saints and Shadows. And it deals with my growing up in El Salvador as a daughter of immigrants. I'm a daughter of a Salvadoran Palestinian Christian father whose family escaped conscription to the Ottoman army and went to El Salvador at the beginning of World War I. My mother's family is Polish, French, and Jewish, and Holocaust survivors. And my mother went to El Salvador as a young woman in the late 50s. I was born and grew up in El Salvador. And through this series, like I said before, I create a refuge against silence and forgetting, also against the forces of assimilation, persecution, and genocide. And I like to trace the path of what I call my terruño, or my homeland, from a diasporic point of view.
Yeah, we were able to speak really briefly before this started about the idea of concepts for which there may be no specific words, or in one language there may be. And I love the idea that your art is also acting in that same way, to act as a way of translating concepts for which there may be no words, or certainly no words in English.
The idea of terruño certainly is that, that's why I like to use it, because it refers to the land, to tierra, but it really has a sense of homeland.
Connection to it. And that's great because you broaden out your inquiry to include not only your family, as we've seen in these past two images, but also other connections with El Salvador, the country of your birth. So tell us a little bit about this image and those connections.
Sure. This is the Todos los Santos Volcán de Izalco, Amen, or Izalco Volcano, Amen. So like I said, I'm interested in my terruño, or my homeland, as a creative space. And this creative space is kind of full of potential, but also complexity. And I like to think of it as a way where, all of these forces come together that can be in conflict, but at the same time find a way to resolve themselves. So with this particular photograph, I begin to create a dialogue between my own personal story and a more collective history. So Izalco volcano was called El Faro del Pacífico, or the Lighthouse of the Pacific, because just before I was born, it was still active and spewing lava. And it was called that way because the boats, as they traveled along the coast of El Salvador, would actually be able to see it. Okay. And in the 1970s, when I was a teenager, the volcano appeared in all of the tourism posters. It was truly emblematic of the landscape of El Salvador. Also, the area of the volcano in the western part of the country happens to be the site of La Matanza, or a 1932 killing of 10,000 to 30,000 indigenous peoples ordered by El Salvador's dictator, El General Hernández Martínez. Hernández Martínez, at that time, also closed El Salvador's borders to Arabs, Chinese, Roma, and Blacks, deeming them pernicious, and instituted a special registry of foreigners, to which my own grandfather, my grandmother, and my father, who was a little boy, like 2 or 3 years old at the time, had to submit their names and thumbprints and other biometric information. So in making this picture, kind of in a move of like transgression and resistance, in a country where we were called Turcos, or Turks, kind of pejoratively, I made the Izalco volcano erupt my great-grandfather's Costa's Greek Orthodox prayer that he wrote in his own calligraphy and that I found in his papers. And it says, "In the blissful and eternal happiness of heaven, in the name of the pure and immaculate Mother of true light, and all the martyrs and saints. Amen."
Wow, that is amazing. And this is such a really haunting image. And I love this idea of how, as we live in a country, we are inscribing our presence. But here you've literally inscribed the presence of your father and grandfather onto the very landscape of this, this iconic landscape for El Salvador. Really fascinating, which gets at this idea of landscape and a sort of broader question about landscape. Let's move ahead, and can you tell us a little bit about the Pulse series that you've been working on and how that intersects with some works you selected from the Walters collection? Let's start with this particular work from the Pulse series.
Well, so the Pulse series is called Pulso, Nuevos Registros Culturales, or Pulse, New Cultural Registers. It's the most recent body of work, and whether, I was dealing with identity and memory, and I have really explored those concepts in most of my work since, the early 90s. But with this particular body of work, I'm really fascinated by the seismic registers of El Salvador. So literally, I'm looking at this kind of scientific, record that exists that imprints the movements of the land. But what I tried to do is create this symbolic transnational terruño using or reframing El Salvador's cultural legacy by embedding images of artworks made by artists who worked at Galería El Laberinto in El Salvador, as well as images that I made at the time in the 80s and 90s when Galería El Laberinto was working. Galería El Laberinto was literally the epicenter of cultural activity during the Civil War years and its aftermath. It was from 1977 till 2001 is when the gallery was working. But the Civil War began basically 1979-80 till 1992. The peace accords happened in 1992, and then there's the post-war years, which are also, a time of great hope. So this gallery also happens to have been founded and directed by my mother, Janine Janowski. So here you see this image that's called Paul's Replicas, Homage Julio Sequeira. In most of the pieces, what I do is not only re-photograph the seismic registers, either with details or like as I found them, and try to find them, through different, depending on what date they were. But I'm overlaying them with images from the artist, like I said. So in this case, it's a Julio Sequeira artist. But what was really interesting in making these things and looking at them is that these seismographs are made of something called a Kodak linograph paper, which apparently was like a silver-based paper. And so it was developed, and it has like these kind of weird latent images, almost as if it had not been developed quite, well, or just maybe it was immersed in the developer really quickly. But anyway, all of these latent images are there that I started seeing. And as you can see on the far right, there's like this image that appears like a volcano is spewing a sphere. And so this particular register is of the 1986 earthquake, which I only experienced from afar because I was already in the US. But I was completely rattled for 3 days because I couldn't get in touch with my parents. But I remembered that my father, who was also an amateur photographer, had made a photograph of Julio Sequeira coming out of the rubble of a building after it had collapsed on him when he was getting a haircut.
Oh my God.
So, at first I thought, well, maybe I'll put that image, as part of this. But then when I realized that there was this latent image of a volcano, I, of course, remembered my own Volcán de Izalco. But I also remembered Julio Sequeira's paintings of these cosmic spheres that are like incredible. And so that's what I ended up putting on, in the middle panel of this piece. And I also love like all the writing on the seismograph. There's like this, I don't know if everybody can see it, but at the bottom it says replicas, which means replica, like, right there. But in Spanish, it also it doesn't only mean replica, it also means aftershock. And so I really loved kind of like the way that, you can read the image because of those kind of inadvertent wordings or, scratches or writings or numbers or whatever that are part of the register.
That is so amazing. I mean, these ghostly images and then superimposition of images on top of each other, and also just this, it's almost riffing off of different time periods, because I think about the idea of chance and the surrealists, and I think of the silver paper and 19th century documentary photography, or photography that is supposedly very just a faithful replica, a faithful representation of what's in front of it, but is affected by so many parts of technology. So that's really fascinating. And then tell us a little bit more about this. This is another work within the Pulse series.
Yeah, and this is a straight kind of detail of one of the registers, and I call it a Parisian, or apparition, because for me it looks like there's a body of a woman there, kind of emerging out of these like dark, shadows and highlights, and it's really evocative. And so I love to think that somehow these registers contain our presence somehow. And so in a way, that's what it's revealing to me.
That's so fascinating. I mean, you think about, what is it brings up so many ideas, collective action. If we were all to jump up and down in one, if the whole country were to jump up and down in one spot, like there's so many different contemporary issues that brings us to fracking and all kinds of things, or we're recording this in February 2021, where a group of investors just made a seismic impact into a particular stock. Oh my goodness. But that brings us, but all of this about this idea of images that one sees and what is intended versus what one sees in an image kind of brings us to this question of who is allowed to represent other people, which brings us to a painting that you chose from the Walters collection, a painting by the American artist Alfred Jacob Miller. What this image from 1858 to 1860, a watercolor on paper called Indian Women. So tell us a little bit about this work. What about this intrigued you or felt connected to your own work?
So, well, I'm really interested in how others are depicted, because I really feel like I am the other. So the depiction of Native Americans in this work and others that we'll see in a minute connects really directly to my work, since it's really an exploration of identity and the issues of representation. So through my work, I really try to subvert or resist representations that are orientalized or objectifying in some way. And specifically, there's like my video piece, Scheherazade, or Performing the Archive, that deals with, that was included in Pulse and Memory, which was my Sondheim exhibition. And it specifically addresses the idea of orientalization, because Scheherazade was this woman who had to tell stories to survive, which is her empowerment. But really in the way that she's depicted, like in Rimsky-Korsakov's, suite, or in the ballets, it's super sexualized and orientalized. And so since I come from Palestinian ancestry, I'm especially sensitive to how Arabs are perceived. And so, but I'm also really interested in how it is that these versions of colonialism or prejudice or Orientalism are aimed at people's, like my own family, but they're also internalized by my own family in El Salvador as a way of defining how they saw themselves. And so, for example, like my great uncle, who was a photographer, this is like I found out while I was making the Saints and Shadows work. He collected 19th century and late 19th century and early 20th century postcards of Bedouin girls that look very much like some of the Miller paintings.
Oh, wow.
And I used them in the video piece. And so I was really interested in that. And I contest this kind of othering and sexualized objectification, which is also heightened in the video by the male gaze of photography, which is represented by my father, who is actually pointing the lens at me. And so it's sort of this layered, analysis in a way of thinking about how it is that photography also is, an instrument of colonization and an instrument of orientalization and all of those things. But at the same time, it's a tool, so I kind of subvert that and own it in a way to make images, to make them be mine, And so I'm interested in those dialogues. I'm interested in the dialogue that, Miller, especially if you go to the next slide, where we have like the text where he's, referring to Native Americans and the females, as savages, and, that basically he says a kindred opinion with the Turks. That is to say that they have no souls, which is something that has been attributed to Native Americans all over, and also to other peoples that are not Western. And so that, obviously is something that needs to be redressed. And I'm really interested in how it is that we are represented, how we Latinos, and anybody, is represented. Through images.
And you talked a little bit about how this I don't know, pejorative term, but very broad. I mean, well, obviously Native American women are not Turks, and yet this term Turks or was particularly fascinating for you. Maybe we can go on to this, but why was Turks such a personal, why did this catch your eye so much?
Well, I mean, if you see these images, we don't have a picture of the postcards. I thought about it as we were like right before we went online today, but the pictures of the Bedouin women look very much like these paintings by Miller. You know, they're like these kind of sexual fantasies for a Western man looking, you know, at these women. And so I'm like interested in that idea at the same time that Turks, you know, Turcos is how Palestinians have been called in Latin America everywhere, in a pejorative way, because we had, you know, we were part of the Ottoman Empire when they first went to the Americas. And so they carried Ottoman laissez-passer or passports. And so I think that that's where that comes from, but it kind of turned because, you know, of all of these other things like Hernandez Martinez's special registry of foreigners. So it definitely became like a way of thinking of Arabs as less than, you know, as not real members of society, or as he said, quote unquote, pernicious. And so I think that there's kind of a similar text, you know, the underlying text in these images is also very similar in that, you know, these women or these people are seen as savages, you know, like in other texts accompanying these images, he speaks about how it would be okay for them to marry a Western man, but, you know, the Native American men treat them so badly. But he basically refers to them in a way as like domesticated animals. You know, it's like really horrible. So anyway, that's kind of part of what I'm thinking about. And also, I mean, I think it also applies to Pulse because through Pulse, I'm asking the viewer. Yeah. Oh, sorry. We can go to that image. This is the image, like a still from Scheherazade or performing the archive, where I'm basically telling the story, and you see a close up at different points in the video. It's a 14-minute video that you can see if you access that exhibition, and I think that the link will be put on the chat or on the comments. So at different points, I'm like narrating, you know, different aspects. And it's basically like a 4-part piece, just like the Scheherazade suite by Rimsky-Korsakov was a 4-part suite. And, you know, the first part's my dad, the second one's my mom. And then the third one is me and my son. So it's also about motherhood. And then at the end, it's like me, the artist. So it's definitely autobiographical. So we can, I guess we can go to this because Pulse, I'm also really interested. I'm asking really the viewer to empathize with us Central Americans in a more nuanced and complex way through the testimony of our own artworks. I think of art critic and activist Lucille Lepard's writings, such as Double Take, the diary of a relationship with an image, and her book Partial Recall, Photographs of Native North Americans, where she describes the various readings of a photograph of a Native American family, for example, and concludes that communities should represent themselves from their own point of view. It turns out that Lepard was also in El Salvador in 1984 at the tail end of Artists Call, Artists Against U.S. Intervention in Central America. And I found out about her trip after discovering a recording of interviews in the Smithsonian Archives of American Art, interviews that she conducted and that unfortunately are labeled unidentified Salvadoran artists. So you can imagine when I listened to this, I was like, what? Unidentified? So
can't you just listen to the tape and just put their names? I mean, this is crazy. Yes.
Yeah. So I listened to them and I was able to actually identify the people that she was speaking with. And you know, Salvadorans are the 3rd largest Latinx population in the United States. There's 2.3 million Salvadorans in the United States, and we're the largest immigrant group in El Salvador. In the Washington D.C. area, and through all kinds of rhetoric, we have been dehumanized and not considered creative beings. We've only been seen through the reductive lens of either criminality or victimhood or exoticism. And in Pulse, I use one of my mother's writings about Rosa Mena Valenzuela, who was an artist in El Salvador. And this piece is called Pulse Exotismo al Revés, or Exoticism Inside Out, where she writes that Rosa Mena Valenzuela creates works that turn exoticism inside out, where those who were considered exotic by European painters are not now the protagonists of her paintings. So it's just kind of an interesting flip to see that. And so in Pulse, I also use some of the writings as kind of textual and visual elements as part of the seismograph.
I love this turning things inside out, and also this idea of pulse in the sense of, a heartbeat, that at times the heartbeat is stronger, at times it's weaker, perhaps at times identity is more able to flourish. We hope we're heading into an era where El Salvadorian identity can be allowed to flourish more freely in the United States and be more recognized. So this is this particular work is really beautiful. I love that idea of the people who were exoticized are now the protagonists of these paintings.
It's great. And these pieces, many of them are printed on aluminum, and it also refers back to Julio Sequeira has a whole series of what he calls metalunios, which are printed on metal. And also I'm like really interested in the whole idea of like what comes from the earth, anyway, so some of these are on paper and some are on metal, and these particular ones are on metal, on aluminum.
I don't know to what degree there's, gold in El Salvador, but it certainly is something that we, think about. To what degree are countries associated with like the lands of gold, the, La Tierra de Oro, and these different kind of ideas of this. So I love this printing on aluminum. It's really amazing. So tell us a little bit about what you're working on right now. It turns out that people could see this work on view. Where can people see the Pulse series on view now?
So I have a solo show right now in Maryland in Potomac at ROFA Projects. The exhibition is called Record Cultural Pulses, and this is an installation view of that exhibition. And it can be seen by appointment. And please contact the gallery, ROFA Projects. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And, there will be some other events that will have like virtual views of the exhibition. But please, people are allowed to come, with masks and a couple at a time. So you can make an appointment to do so. These three images, the first one is an homage to Rosa Mena Valenzuela, but also to my mother, because this is her wedding gown on the left side, and on the right side is La Novia, or the Bride, by Rosa Mena Valenzuela. So it kind of uses, the lace as this element that runs through both panels. And I particularly love how the edge ends like that, because it reminds us of maps, and in a way I am mapping this cultural legacy, onto the registers, and I think, and then the next image is sort of a self-portrait. It's a photograph of my back that I made as a self-portrait in the 80s, and I love how the seismograph numbers, become my spine. With a Carlos Cañas image peering out.
And of course, what is the seismograph? But it's registering the spine of the country in a certain sense too. So it's really wonderful.
Yeah, and then this is also a photograph of a child that I photographed at the beach. He was, playing at the beach, and from 1983. And so it's also with the seismograph of that time. And so there's like an attempt to, to bring together the seismograph of the time with the photographs or the images that were made during that time, to kind of give a sense of, these artistic images or voices that are coming through, or an actual testimony or witnessing of our journey.
Fantastic. I mean, this for me, actually, I have to plug the Walters a little bit. We are about to open a show called Translations and Transitions, or Traducciones y Transiciones, a celebration of Mexico and Central American independence, 1821 to 2021. And one of the unfortunate voids in our collection is we did not have anything from El Salvador to put into the exhibition. So I'm really excited that we're talking to you and getting to hear a little bit more about this. Can you tell us, we already are starting to get questions in the comments, but I just wanted to allow you to just talk about, how do you see Pulse continuing in the future? What are the next steps for the Pulse series?
So I would love to go back to photograph. I photographed these registers right before the pandemic, right before everything shut down. I came back from El Salvador like March 4th, I think.
Oh my God.
So it was, so I photographed for a week at the Archivo Nacional General de la Nación, which are the National Archives. And I would love to go back to find more specific dates, so I found the 1986 earthquake. I found some 1992 peace accord, like some registers that were like at the time of the peace accords. But I'd also like to find other like important dates that I have some sort of registry or some sort of visual to bring back. And I would love to also include all of the artists who were working during that time, so that there's a representation of them. And right now, I've like starting to just barely scratch the surface, and there's much more to do. So I'm really looking forward to, hopefully we'll be able to go back and soon and do that. I spent most of the pandemic, I was lucky enough to be able to do that, like just making this work. And so I'm continuing, hopefully. I mean, I still feel like there's so much more to uncover. And I'm really intrigued by these latent images that are part of the seismograph. Also, if you're in Richmond, there's a show at Candela Gallery, and one of my pieces is in that show as well. It's called Photography is Dead, but it's not.
It's terrific. I mean, if we have more time, we can talk about Laberinto projects as well, but I just want to highlight, I think it was Char Brooks who was talking about maybe this one, or one of these Pulse series. These images reminds me of redacted documents. Maybe it's this one, redacted documents that are full of secrets, the annotations on things. And it's very interesting to think about, government uses for documents, artistic uses for documents, and data, apparently, purely factual data.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, there's so many layers in these documents, and it depends like who uses them and how you use them. And so definitely all of these records are really interesting. But they don't, that I just went like completely just me. That's so funny on the screen. I also see another question by Adriana Herrera. Hola, Adriana. She says, can you talk a little bit more about the nature of your manual interventions on the files before printing them? I think that, what I can say is that they're basically, I've rephotographed the seismic registers, and I look at them on my computer along with trying to think about, or maybe just making very intuitive connections to images from the archive, from the Laberinto archive, and from my own photographic archive. So I look through my negatives, I rephotograph them, I I look through the papers of the gallery. I look through, the reproductions of works that were exhibited that I have photographed, because I photographed a lot of my mom's collection. And so there's just like this whole process of trying to find ways, and it's sort of in like a very intuitive, playful kind of process. Like, I don't know exactly how to explain it, but there's not much that happens to the actual registers, other than I'm overlaying things to see what happens, to see how they look, and what connections I might be able to make between the dates or what was happening, or the actual artist and what was he working on, or what the theme of the painting might be, etc.
Yeah, I'm so sorry about that. Had a tiny glitch there for a second. I'm so sorry about that. I was just trying to get into the comments.
No worries.
But let's see. We actually can maybe bring back up the slides, but thank you so much for talking about that. Wondering if we want to also talk a little bit, as we wait for more questions to come in, to talk a little bit about Laberinto projects. What made you decide to develop this initiative? How has that been going? And, we're, of course, in the middle. We're getting a question back to Pulse. Back to Pulse, which is, Muriel, you talked about the material on which the images in Pulse are printed. Can you also talk about their size and horizontality? Oh, that's a great question. A fantastic question.
Okay. Hi, Erina. It's great to hear you, see you. So the material on which the images are printed, but also about their size and horizontality. So the images are right now ranging between like 20 by 30 is sort of an average, but a little bit smaller for the metal pieces, but also larger, like a little bit larger than 20 by 30. The image size is 20 by 30, but the metal piece is a little bit bigger. And most of them are horizontal, but not all of them. I think that part of it is that these linographs are really long. And at the beginning, I was thinking that I would make like all of them really long. But the way that, the process works and how it was that I started putting images together, they didn't all work like the first Julio Sequeira image. I may be able to do more like that as I photograph more, but, it wasn't necessarily something that that worked out in the ones that I've done right now. I think that it's a scroll. I don't have any images we also have some scrolls that are part of the exhibition at ROFA that you can see that kind of refer back to the archive. And they're like different photographs that I made kind of put together, and they're just like these long things. And so those are more specific reference to the actual archive. But these, I think, are more like a new archive in a way, like something for Erina for the future. So Erina is actually has been working on an exhibition that will be at Tufts, and I'm included in that show, and it's about artist call, and artists have been commissioned to do some work. So she is partly responsible for my doing Pulse, because she was like, I want you to do this work. So thank you. It will be in 2022, I believe. And Gabriela says something, Muriel, would be good to remember to the public that people can also schedule virtual tours with you at ROFA projects, even though we have all the required health measures and you can do in-person visits, you can also do virtual tours. So if you would like to do a virtual tour of the exhibition, please, let's do it.
Great point that in this time, people you can be in the space, which is so invaluable, but then if you're very concerned, you can also be doing the virtual visit, which is great. Yeah. I see we have another question from Adriana Herrera, which is, have you thought of creating an artist book with this series? I certainly would want to see an artist book with this.
That would be very nice. Yeah, I would love to make a book, of course. An artist book is something that's always interested me. I've never really done one, but there's so much material. It would be great. So yeah, it would be great. I don't know yet, but it's a good idea, and I would love to definitely do a book, a specific artist book. I suppose that you mean something that's like in an edition. That's, more like hands-on, which would be really lovely. Yes, it would be great. It's all about, everything is about time and resources in the end.
I have a question myself, which is just, there's been quite a few different contemporary artists lately that have been interrogating questions of land. I mean, not even going back to the 60s, but just recently land, and especially a lot of artists here in Baltimore and more broadly who are healing the land through interventions that engage with maybe local plants, local places. But I'm just so fascinated. How did you even have the idea to go to these seismic registers? I mean, I guess I would never have even. How did this even come to your mind? And then how did you find that they were such a rich source?
So when I started, so actually going back to your question of Laberinto projects, when I started Laberinto projects, which was, so my mother died in 2012. And since she passed away, I began to think of ways that I could honor her memory and her culture and her legacy, as a cultural promoter. And also all of the artists who had worked with her, because, there's just like such a lack of documentation. And so I created Laberinto projects for this, for that archive to actually live, and for that knowledge to be communicated, but also to create like artist residencies and workshops at the site of her house, which overlooks the volcanic lake of Coatepeque. And one of the first workshops that I did was a workshop that I taught that was called The Artist and the Archive. And we got together with a group of Central American artists, a Colombian and a US. It was like 12 of us, I believe. And it was sponsored by the Centro Cultural de España in San Salvador, the Cultural Center of Spain in San Salvador. And as one of the things that we did is that we went to the National Archives in El Salvador. And as we were getting a tour by one of the conservators, we went into this room that was filled with these seismic registers. And I was just like, and I was entranced by them. I was like, oh, I need to do something with this. And this is 2017. And it was at the same time that I found the interviews by Lucille Lepard at the Smithsonian. And so this kind of bubbled in my head for a while, and it simmered until last year, when I'm actually in 2019, I went in September to a very quick trip to El Salvador in September, and I decided to go one afternoon to the archives to see if I could be let in and photograph just a little bit before I was leaving. And I did it, and I did a couple of images. Actually, the Rosamena Valenzuela, the bride image, I did in 2019, and then this one, yeah. And so it's interesting because it's like the first image that joins my mom with one of the artists. It's like her wedding dress and la novia, and then I went back at the end of February and March, and so it's because I saw that room and it kept gnawing at me. It was like, you have to do something. And when I was trying to figure out how, especially after Erina Dugan actually said, we're doing this exhibition, it would be great if you did these images, because we had been talking. We actually did a residency together in Colorado. And we were talking about Artist Call and about Galeria Laberinto's legacy. And so we were trying to find points of contact. And we just kept thinking about it, and I wasn't sure how I was going to make these images. It just kept like, I kept thinking about it, and one day I just went, okay, that's it. I'm going to use the registers that I saw, but let me test it. And that's when I went and like did a couple of images, and it worked. So there's like great potential. Yeah, and I've used other kinds of archives before. There's a whole series that's called Ex Post Facto, which is based on my father's dental archive, because he was a dentist. Oh. And it's and I imagine the effects of trauma on the body through the X-rays.
Oh, wow. I mean, that's sort of so interesting for me, even just from an archaeological point of view, because we can tell where people grew up based on, in archaeological times, based on the amount of this element strontium in their teeth. And it's different elements in their teeth. So you can find out where people in in ancient times, whether they grew up in that place or they were, lived their childhood in a different place. And so it's so interesting how even something that seems like, oh, this is human and this is the land, but there's some crossing over there. And I don't know, interesting.
Yeah, for me, they're similar. They're similar process. It's a similar process for me to think about. In ex post facto, which means after the fact, I didn't overlay anything. I used the archives kind of as they were, but then they get transformed by my selection into looking like landscape. And so here I'm like looking, at these registers in a different way, also like landscape, but adding more elements.
Wow, that's fabulous. I'm just wondering if we should give everybody one more minute to just think of any last questions that they have. We can just take a look at maybe a couple more of these images and thinking about Laberinto projects, which people can access through your website, murielhasbun.com.
Yes.
I did love that we were and more of these series from Pulse. Chandy Kelly, our own Chandy Kelly, is writing in to say, the series is beautiful. Thank you for sharing, Muriel. Can you share a little bit about the connection to the earth in your art making, like to literal earth in your art making process?
Sure. So like I said, the terruño has always been like kind of a symbolic kind of space for me, and it literally connects to the volcanic sand of the beach where I went as a child. That's the volcanic sand that I connect with. I've done some other installations like Auvergne Toi et Moi, which can be seen at the Rofa exhibition, that deals with my mother's hiding in France during World War II, where I actually have the volcanic rocks from both places, the Auvergne, which is a volcanic land, and El Salvador, which is also volcanic land, and they're in the space. And so I make a connection between these two places, that how coincidental could it be that my mother chose to settle in a land that mirrored her childhood refuge. And so there's that connection that I've made, also kind of layered with the land and the volcanic sand. There's these thorns that are part of that are on the beach in El Salvador. They're called iscanal, which they're from a bush that grows along the rivers in El Salvador, and during the rainy season, these thorns wash onto the ocean, and then they land on the volcanic sand, and they're black. They're the acacia thorn, I believe, the acacia horn tree that has like a symbiotic relationship with ants. It's a really wild thing. If you go into a tree that has these thorns, don't get close because the ants will will bite you.
Oh,
But
no.
but the thorns are also, like in my childhood experience, basically going, on the land, on the sand at the beach, you could also get pricked by these thorns, by these iscanal thorns. And so I've used those in my work as well.
Ooh.
So there's all kinds of connections, I guess, to the earth in the art making process, Shandy. It's great to hear from you.
I'm being reminded that we are already at 50 minutes rather than 30 minutes as this is often supposed to be, but I can't resist because I work on Art of the Ancient Americas. So we will have one last question, and maybe it may be a yes or no answer. Kathy McCluskey asks, have you ever incorporated any pre-Columbian motifs into your images? And
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, so we'll have to have you come back to the Walters, and we hope that this is the first of many talks and collaborations. It has been such a pleasure and an honor to speak with you. As everybody can see, please, at the bottom, you can follow Muriel's work on Instagram at Muriel Photo, and online at her website, murielhasbun.com and laberintoprojects.com.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much, Muriel. This has been a delight.
It's been amazing. Thank you. And I know that we have a lot to talk about, so we can continue. And thanks everybody for being here and for all these amazing questions. I feel so supported. It's awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you to everybody. Okay.
Yeah. And you can also see the Pulse and Memory show, which shows a lot more of the Pulse images, some of my Si Je Meurs, If I Die images, and the Scheherazade video. And then come to see the Rofa Gallery, Rofa Projects show.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Antonio.